Greetings, friends of liberty. Now 'tis with good reason that Queen Elizabeth is held in almost universal acclaim by all those who love this land of limestone cliffs, since her accomplishments, A, in solidifying the Protestant nature of England, B, in equipping the nation with a vigorous navy to vanquish the dreaded Armada and to explore new continents, and C, in fostering a renaissance of our greatest artists and poets, show her abundant good sense, placing her on a high historical pedestal indeed. And yet, nonetheless, there is one weakness she possessed that should escape neither attention nor mention, and that would be in her sponsoring of monopolies, which were granted to some of her favorites, giving them the exclusive right to sell certain items. So, for example, she gave to one company the exclusive right to sell currants, to another salt, to others the exclusive rights to sell Irish yarn, Spanish wool, and even bottles and brushes. One case that became famous above all was her giving to Edward Darcy, a groom of her chamber, the exclusive right to sell, of all things, playing cards. He alone, in all of England, possessed the right of their importation and sale. Now, naturally, this unjust monopoly rankled everyone's sense of fair play. Everyone, of course, except those granted the monopoly. And what occurred next was that a certain Thomas Allen decided to continue manufacturing his own playing cards, as he had done, and as most would admit he had a perfect right to do. Whereupon the groom of the chamber, Darcy, sued him in 1602. And so the case, Darcy v. Allen, brought to court, was thankfully decided in Allen's favour. The court reasoned Queen Elizabeth's monopoly unjustly prevented others who make playing cards, such as the Guild of Haberdashers, from engaging in their occupation, that those who wanted to buy the cards now had to pay a higher price and perhaps receive a lower quality card because of the lack of producer competition, and that the Queen's rationale for granting the monopoly, enhancing the public good, clearly was fallacious, and in fact the opposite. A private gain of the monopolists had occurred. Now, although this battle had been won, the war against monopoly dragged on for many years, since Queen Elizabeth's successor, James I, granted even more monopolies to his many lovers and favourites at court, such as Georges Villiers and Giles Montpasson. Finally, Parliament in 1624 was able to pass the Statute of Monopolies, which, aside from monopolies granted for patents and inventions, otherwise outlawed them all. Thanks be to God. Now, if we turn to the issuance of state-granted and monopolistic privileges, whether in part or whole, in your own 21st century in the Federal Republic of Germany, we find today that this practice, more colloquially and generally known as crony capitalism, has continued in part unabated on the continent, with severe results for the German economy. In Wolfgang Muenchau's Kaput, The End of the German Miracle, we see a seasoned economic and financial journalist explaining how the Germans took their own economic miracle, the post-World War II Wirtschaftswunder, and transformed it into an increasingly moribund economy incapable of adapting to the swiftly changing and unforgiving atmosphere of the modern world. Indeed, Germany is expected to have essentially no growth at all for fiscal years 2023, 4, and 5. Muenchau begins with an example which highlights one of the changes. In the town of Mülheim, in which he grew up, there were, among the many entrepreneurs which characterized Germany's post-war economic boom, one of the greatest of all, Karl Albrecht, who, along with his brother, invented a new retail concept, the discount store with a limited range and very low prices. They called it Aldi, which stood for Albrecht Discount. But did Karl, the CEO, seek governmental privilege, the favoring of his business through the lobbying of politicians? No, the Albrechts were mostly invisible. By the time Karl died at the age of 94 in 2014, he was not only the richest man in Germany and number 20 in the world, he also had never met a German chancellor in his lifetime. But as we shall see, that is not at all representative of German companies presently. As Muenchau summarizes, Aldi is still there, but the entrepreneurialism it used to represent is gone. His next complaint is the failure of the German economy because the government favored analog businesses to transition to the digital era. Some authors, in accepting this ideology, have even written books called Digital Dementia or Cyber Sick, and have gone so far as to argue that schools should not be using any digital content whatsoever. And so, in 2020, only 33% of German pupils had access to a digital learning platform, whereas the OECD average was 54%. Perhaps not surprisingly, given his stubborn adherence to the analog, Germany now has only one leading software company, SAP. Of the world's top 50 tech companies, it is the only one that is German. Germans invented the fuel-driven car engine, the electron microscope, and the Bunsen burner. But they did not invent the computer, the smartphone, or the electric car. And thus, in the US, the telecommunications systems and the postal service all transitioned, but in Germany, they lagged behind. So, for example, when in the 1990s, Muenchau asked a Siemens manager his views about the prospects for cell phones, the manager responded to me condescendingly, "You mean those little devices that people carry?" Yes, those. And the problem here, he argues, was in the government favoring those precise companies that lagged behind. A typical example is German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and French Premier Mitterrand subsidizing the development of highly complex, high-definition cable television and analog-age technology, which promised to produce what the two leaders thought would be a massively popular viewing experience. The whole exercise was technically exceedingly difficult, and analog-era HD TV was formally abandoned in 1993. So here the state and two leaders forced these top-down choices on the public, choices that German businesses should have made instead without state influence or subsidy. Not surprisingly, the latest data suggests that fiber optic connections only account for 10% of all internet connections. The OECD average is 35.5%. France is 51.4%, and Spain 81.2%. As a result, Germany's internet is slow, a famous demonstration of that being when a photojournalist in Dortmund transferred 4.5 gigs of data to a neighboring town faster by horse than over the internet. Of course, Germany, most notoriously in contradiction to its green policies, has outlawed nuclear energy, going even beyond the other countries of the West who have only partially criminalized nuclear operations by their unnecessarily stringent regulatory requirements. And so Germans fell back on doing what they did comparatively best. The US has the digital industry and Hollywood, France has food and fashion, the UK has finance. Germany specialized in cars and mechanical and chemical engineering, with some of the most illustrious industrial companies in the world: Siemens, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Continental, Höchst, BASF, Bayer, Linde, Mannesmann, and Bosch. Another factor which plays into Germany's present malaise is the rise of the Asian tigers. At first, Germany could make many sales of machinery and cars to them, but after a while, they too are becoming proficient, so that Germany's products are becoming less competitive. And so how can we characterize this present top-down German system of government-directed and privileged steering of their economy? As a type of neo-mercantilism, which Muenchau says everybody in Germany was supporting, including the two largest party groups, Merkel's Christian Democrats, the CDU, and sister party, the CSU, and the Social Democrats, the SPD. And all those parties supported the export-driven model of German economic success. The CEOs of those chosen industries in turn had special access to government, unlike Karl Albrecht, the entrepreneurial anti-hero of my hometown. It felt at times as though the car industry chiefs had their own private keys to the chancellery in Berlin. Yet another aspect of this top-down system began in the 1970s in using the public sector banking system to support the government's macroeconomic policy. For example, its stabilization policies through increases or reductions in bank lending in a counter-cyclical manner to fight booms and busts. Later, some of these banks, called Landesbanken, were fully protected from bankruptcy, which gave them a better credit rating, which in turn allowed them to offer lower interest loans. And because the banks were favored, there are more of them. So Germany accounts for 24% of the EU's population and 34% of its banks. In addition, the banks were not just lenders, they took strategic stakes in companies and were often represented on their boards, alongside supportive politicians. This often led to banks in different regions investing in traditional regional businesses, such as shipbuilding in the north and steel production in the Rhine, and not in startups of new technology, with Germany, as a result, having only 1.9 startups per 100,000 citizens compared to 5.2 for the US. Government ownership of banks allowed the government to collect savings and channel them to favored projects. They became a slush fund to circumvent taxpayers. The politicians who perhaps more than any others symbolized this German crony capitalism were Gerhard Schröder, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and Sigmar Gabriel, known in Germany as the Putin-Verstehers, which satirically means those who understand and empathize with Vladimir Putin. Schröder, in particular, took the first prize, intervening, for example, while chancellor to save companies in his state from going bankrupt, directing Russian business orders their way, and most notoriously, while and after he left office, in arranging for over 2 decades for ever greater cooperation in transferring Russian gas to Germany. Chancellor Angela Merkel, for her part, was more wary of Putin, and after his 2014 invasion of the Crimea, helped to arrange European sanctions against him. Muenchau points out that after Donald Trump was elected U.S. president, he accused Germany of being a prisoner of Russia due to its growing gas dependence and the construction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Due to the anti-Trump mood in Germany, his statement was not taken seriously. But on this point, Trump was right. But Germany nonetheless poured money and investment into Russia, with $1.77 billion invested in 2015 and $1.07 in 2016. That money being used by BMW to complete a plant in Kaliningrad in 2018 that would handle the complete production of passenger cars, as well as by Continental to build a state-of-the-art tire plant in Russia. All that investment, of course, came crashing down along with the gas deliveries when Putin finally invaded the Ukraine in 2022. But it has taken 3 difficult years for German politicians to reconsider their ban on nuclear energy, despite the fact that they're not getting Russian gas anymore. As Muenchau says, what strikes me most is the unbelievable recklessness. First, the neo-mercantilists bet the house on Russian gas, then the Greens bet the house on ending nuclear. In a free society with no top-down direction, Germany would have made more rational energy choices. Of course, given the German readiness to do business in politically dubious countries, it was not surprising that Germany had no problems, as did, of course, many countries around the world, in investing in China from the 1990s on. Many politicians and influential figures became China lobbyists, among them SPD head Rudolf Scharping and CSU stars Hans-Peter Friedrich and Karl Theodor Gutenberg, with China responding to German investment by creating a Belt and Road Initiative focused on Duisburg. In 2011, the first train on the China Railway Express arrived in Duisburg from Chongqing in southwestern China, via Russia and Belarus. Thousands more followed over the years. But the basic long-term problem for Germany was illustrated by the Chinese production of solar panels, in which China in the end rapidly produced quality panels at a significantly lower price point, decimating Germany's own industry. In addition, as happened with many companies, when German companies invested in China, they had to hand over their technical know-how to their joint venture partner companies. In other words, China first stole the German tech, but then advanced beyond it by creating their own. The result was the bankruptcy of many German companies, among them former industry leaders like Qcell, SolarWorld, and Solon. Interestingly, as Muenchau remarks, this leaves us with an important question. Is Germany being outmuscled by a rival using a supercharged version of the same neo-mercantilist system as Germany has? And the answer, of course, is yes. But what he fails to say is that actually Chinese industrial production will be even more misdirected and their resources misallocated than the German has been in the past. So how should Germany address its problems? Should it turn to a more service-based economy? Muenchau claims that the Germans are skeptical of this approach, saying, for Germans, the services industry is bankers and prostitutes. They call it the tertiary sector. More fundamentally, part of the problem with Germany's economy historically is what's called ordoliberalism, in which the free market and its free principles are deliberately compromised in certain ways. Ordoliberalism can be understood roughly as three-quarters of a free market, it differing from a purely free market in having minimum wages, a significant governmental unemployment insurance, a government old age pension, labor union power and co-determination over business decisions, a significant governmental regulation of the labor market, and F, the belief that monopolies naturally occur in free markets, and so companies need to be controlled by the state. Ordoliberalism in the labor market is exemplified by the case that Muenchau presents, showing the problems that a UK academic who wants to move to Germany would face. A, his German university pay would apparently be set by law, which means that coming from the UK, he will have to take a pay cut, no matter how good he is individually. And B, his child can't get credit for schoolwork he did in the UK, so would be forbidden from attending an academic track in the future, meaning he could only get a vocational job. As a result of these types of silly requirements, the jobs gap grew to a record 633,000 in 2023. This trend is strongest among highly qualified workers. For some companies, the skill shortage are getting quite serious, even to the extent that industrial companies have had to close assembly lines because they could not find workers. Again, this is just an example from the labor market. Other sectors of the economy face a similar set of stultifying regulations. Although I've given the core of his arguments, Muenchau mentions numerous other issues, such as A, the irrationality of the German Green Party, with its hatred of nuclear energy and its insistence that homeowners install expensive heat pumps, which drastically backfired on them politically in 2024. B, how Germany historically has had troubles getting its defense spending up to even 2%, never mind NATO's levels of 3 or more percent. And C, the rise of both the pro-Russia far right, represented by the AfD party, and the pro-Russia far left, represented by Sarah Wagenknecht's new party, the BSW. Overall, I'd give this book a B, because while he points out numerous failures, he also makes some analytical mistakes of his own. Let's briefly take these one by one. Number one, he's a quasi-Keynesian, and so thinks, uncharacteristically for a German, that the traditional German focus on keeping federal budgets in check, in line with revenues, is a mistake. He says, for example, in June 2009, I wrote in my Financial Times column that the 0.35% deficit limit was economically illiterate and would lead to lower investments. That is pretty much what has happened. He wants quantitative easing and governmental spending during recessions, and even when exports decline, claiming because of its dependence on exports, Germany was much more susceptible to global shocks than the US and would therefore require more counter-cyclical fiscal policies. In other words, he believes Germany's willingness and ability to engage in fiscal restraint makes no economic sense. This is false. Number two, despite his complaining about German politicians directing the economy and giving subsidies to their favored industries, he too believes in the exact same policy, potentially, saying, I am not making a blanket argument against industrial policy. Industrial policy can be successful, like the US bet on semiconductors in the 1950s or Europe's creation of Airbus in 1970. What happened in Germany was that industrial policy came at the expense of economic diversification. This too is false. Number three, and so when it comes to subsidizing EV cars, which he believes are the future, he says, while they were asleep at the wheel in Berlin, Wolfsburg, Stuttgart, and Munich, China was busy creating an entire new industry from scratch. Of course, this occurred, as mentioned, because the Chinese government completely privileged this industry with massive subsidies. Is he for that? Apparently so in this case. So there you have it, the pluses and minuses of Muenchau's understanding of Germany's economy. Happy for my part that we English at the turn of the 19th century finally abolished most monopolies and much of what you call crony capitalism. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.